Hello, this is Eric Steinhart, and you're listening to Catholic versus Other.
Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, if you would, please. Who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe what you believe.
Well, I was raised in rural Pennsylvania a long time ago in a pretty fundamentalist Protestant kind of household, and most of my male relatives were and are Protestant ministers. And so that was a pretty intensely biblical kind of household in a kind of pretty literalist way. Not entirely sure that my father or mother really believed a lot of it. But nevertheless, my father was very involved in church things. I think my mother at first maybe thought, well, this is a social thing you do. But still, we studied the Bible a lot. My grandfather was a real old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone preacher. And then maybe it'll be surprising to you. I mean, I got a master's degree in philosophy at Boston College, a Catholic school, and interacted with a lot of the Jesuits. Really enjoyed that. They were fantastic people, and what a great education, and great to be exposed to a very, very different form of Christianity. My grandfather was pretty anti-Catholic in a way that, back in, let's say, the 1930s, it existed in hardcore Protestant circles. But I found the Catholic view of things to be very, very different, very intriguing, and just loved talking with the Jesuits. Then I've gone off in all kinds of complicated, different sorts of directions.
Before we get into sort of the journey as such, I want to start with that starting point where you realize that you're sentient. So I want your earliest memories that have a religious overtone. If you could just talk about one or two of the highlights.
Oh, sure. I was involved with religious activity from a very, very young age. It's perhaps hard to imagine what the Steinhart family was like back in the early 60s. We were raised to be ministers. I gave my first sermon to a full church of hundreds of people, probably at about 5 years old. Yeah, that was...
Wow.
This was the family business, And so even though, my father was not an ordained minister, he was a lay pastor and went and spoke frequently at all kinds of churches for a long time. This is just what you did. So I took religion very seriously, but I think that perhaps my early awareness of it was kind of a very complex awareness, as this is what you do. Your profession, this might be what you do, right? And that was a different way, perhaps, of looking at it than someone who comes to it from a sort of solitary point of view and says, oh, gee, I'm in church, what am I doing? My experience of being in church was being up at the pulpit. Even if I wasn't, it was my grandfather or father or some other family member up there, or I would have to come up and give a little speech or interpret a Bible verse, and this was just what you did. That's what we did in church.
Do you remember the name of the denomination, or was it sort of...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what was it?
Evangelical Congregational.
Okay. No strings attached to a remote hierarchy.
Right.
That's the Congregationalist idea.
Right. And then the Evangelical Congregationalists of this particular brand were Pennsylvanians who came over from Germany. Pennsylvania Dutch migrations, not Dutch, it's Deutsch. So we were Pennsylvania Deutsch, and came over with not with the farmers, but with the steel millers and coal miners. Right. So my grandfather ministered to the steel millers and coal miners in northeast Pennsylvania. That's how that all started.
So when did you start to falter in your faith, or did you ever have a real faith where you had a relationship with Jesus Christ or with God the Father or with the Holy Spirit? And if you did have a relationship at one point, when did it start to falter? Was it maybe puberty with sexual desires and all that, or how did it happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I worry a little bit about the language of faltering or something like that. So some people want to draw a kind of very sharp, well-policed boundary between, say, atheism and theism, and I just don't see it that way.
When did you stop calling yourself Christian, or have you not stopped calling yourself Christian? Are you Christian? Or if not, when did you stop calling yourself Christian?
Yeah, I would not call myself a Christian today. I don't know that I ever stopped. Obviously, I must have stopped sometime, right? That's just logic. But it's not that important to me.
When did it start being not that important to you?
I think it just got less and less and less important. So I was certainly raised in a context where what you believe is of utmost importance. Even though what we believed went along with lots of doing weird stuff. And so I started to think more that what I believe isn't that important.
But did you live a wild life at any point with women and wine and rock and roll?
Not really.
You're giving us philosophers a bad name, in other words.
I wish I could say I was, wild, but my wildness is not very impressive, I'm happily married. Well, Satan's going to get you, and drag you into this stuff. And I was like, man, I don't have those interests.
Can you talk just in overview about your sort of career in philosophy?
Yeah, sure. So, I actually started out as a computer scientist. I have a bachelor's in computer science, worked as a computer scientist for 9 years. I've got patents. I've got all kinds of stuff like that. I was always interested in philosophy. And the philosophical interest came out of the religious background because, my grandfather and father were very interested in Christian philosophy. Pretty high-level discussion when I was a kid. So I was always interested in philosophy, just gradually got more and more into it, and sort of at the tail end of my computer days just thought, well, I'm going to just do this. We'll see where it goes. So I've been philosophy professor for nearly 25 years, and I've started out exploring computery things and then got more it must be genetic. I just drifted more and more to thinking about religious issues. So okay, I'm not a preacher, but I'm a do philosophy of religion, and it's just there's got to be some DNA in here that's making that happen. So I am interested in religion philosophically. I think we are in a time of enormous religious change, and that's what's interesting to me now.
I did recently interview Graham Oppy. Are you kindred spirits, or is there shared interest?
I think he thinks that there's a really sharp contrast between theism and atheism. So if you're not a classical theist, you're just an atheist. And yeah, sure, logically, in a sense of that's kind of true, but I don't think it captures the richness of religious diversity today. Both ancient and modern pagans, their gods are finite. They're in the natural world. They don't have creator gods. Zeus doesn't create the universe. Zeus has a mom and dad. He has a body. They have blood. Athena hits Ares on the head with a rock. And the Stoic concept of the logos, right, or a Neoplatonic conception of the one. These are not Abrahamic, monotheistic gods. They're different things. So there's a slogan from Michael York, the contemporary pagan theologian. He says, well, pagans believe in gods, but not God. And he also wants to make it clear that there's a pagan conception of divinities that isn't monotheistic. It's not theistic at all. So I don't see that there's a dichotomy between theism and atheism. Like I think a lot of contemporary philosophers of religion try to say, well, these are your two options. You either have, let's say, the Christian or Islamic God, or no gods, or you can't be religious, right? And that seems false.
A friend of mine, a Greek friend of mine I used to work with, he got excited about the resurgence of the Olympian pantheon coming back into favor as a sort of neo-pagan religion. There were people that are taking up the 12 gods.
Right.
I don't find it that interesting just because I think that we need an uncaused first cause, a necessary being. I'm more with Anselm. My journey was through Plato, Augustine, Anselm, and then Descartes. That was my journey to monotheism. So it's diametrically opposed to your sort of Aristotelian approach, I think, to religion. Is that fair to say?
No, don't ever call me an Aristotelian. If that's how I'm coming across, I've failed in life. But you talked about right Hellenismos, the reconstruction of ancient Greek paganism. There's lots of reconstructions of these paganisms, and I mean, what you said about wanting there to be an uncaused first cause, well, you could be a Wiccan. You know, the theology comes from Neoplatonism. There's the great first cause, and, you know, it sort of divides into a god and goddess, but that's kind of just ancient Stoic stuff, Zeus and Hera. But again, these are ways of being religious or responding to religious urges, or let's just say the call of divinity, that aren't atheistic. Well, they're not really theistic either, because you mentioned Anselm, which I think was good, because the pagans aren't going to recognize that, right? Like, there's a first cause, sure, and that started everything off, and the Big Bang, or the cause of the universe, or evolution, or whatever. But there's no maximally perfect being, you know. But that doesn't mean that there aren't gods and goddesses. And I philosophically, I don't want to say, you know, like personally I believe in this or that, but what I want to say is philosophically, that immediately shows that there's a third way, right? So are they atheists? Well, in one sense, they are, right? They don't believe in God, a capital G, maximally perfect being of Anselm. But in another sense, they're not, because they believe in gods and goddesses.
You know, Hinduism is a strange, slippery religion. I don't know that much about it, but there's a dance between polytheism and monotheism, an elusive flexibility that they have, I think that you would find very attractive.
I find Hinduism interesting. I guess it was never part of my kind of, you know, lived experience, you know, culture. Whereas one thing that I find very interesting is Mormonism. You know, and I'm not a Mormon, you know, by any means, but I'm here in America, and there's lots of Mormons, and I've met them. They've, you know, invited me to speak to some of their conferences. I mean, they'll tell you that they're Christians. Probably most other Christians disagree. But look at their theology. I mean, God was a man just like me and you, right? And had a mom and dad and has kids. And you're going to be a god too. And you're going to get your own universe. And you're going to populate it with your babies. That's fascinating to me. That certainly isn't anything like Anselmian monotheism. It's a polytheism. It's clearly polytheistic. You know, maybe it's false, but it's not false because it's proposing some weird set of alien categories, right? God was a man who like me. I mean, Joe Smith says it, you know, man of flesh and bone. And there's not really anything like that corresponds to, let's say, a monotheistic view of the supernatural, right? God lives on a planet. It's called Kolob, you know?
What do you think of Scientology?
I tend to think that Scientology is not a religion. Now that's, you know, my opinion, thinking about religion. It's an educated opinion, and I guess under the First Amendment in the U.S., it's treated as a religion, so there's one clearly legalistic sense in which it is.
How did your grandfather see the Jews? How did you see the Jews? And how do you see the Jews today?
Very positively. You know, my grandfather lived through World War II and was very opposed to any kind of anti-Semitism, as was my father. I know this explicitly because of things they did. You know, I can also say that despite some of my grandfather's theology, that kind of religion, even though it was very much our religion, was also very, very tolerant. You know, I grew up in the 60s, and a very Protestant area. There was a Catholic church, and there were fights that would break out, you know, in school or things. Like, you know, Catholics were a very small minority. And we actually went, my father took us to this Catholic church in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania for, I think, a month or so. He was at that time a high school principal and a community leader, and said, look, Catholic Mass to Catholic Church on Sundays to demonstrate that they were welcome in the community. And that certainly made a big impression on me in terms of religious tolerance.
Can you talk a little bit about Islam? What's your impression? What do you like? What don't you like about Islam?
Growing up, I had never heard of it, right? I mean, certainly there were Catholics, there were some Jewish people in our area, and so I knew about those religions. Never heard about Islam until much later in life. Right now, where I teach, we have a large number of Muslim students. I've learned so much about Islam from them. It's not a monolithic religion where everyone's, lined up with marching orders or something. It's rich. It's culturally rich. There are wide differences of opinion and wide, all the richness of human life is there. So I love it. I've enjoyed interacting with my Muslim students and learning about Islam. It's dispelled a lot of, I think, people say negative things about Islam, and there's negative things about any religion. And again, for me, this has been about the expansion of religious awareness. I've come to appreciate that Muslims have this very rich religious tradition and religious life too.
I hate politics, left versus right, that whole dichotomy. What is your impression of that? Why is it such a popular hobby?
Politically, right now, the United States seems to be going through, what's sometimes called the demographic shift, both racially, religiously. If you just start to actually look at the data, what's commonly called white Christian America by the sociologists, right? It's dying out. And this is a massive change. This is probably the largest demographic change in the United States ever. I don't know what the U.S. will look like in 50 years. I don't think I'll be here to see it. But it already doesn't look like the U.S. that I grew up in 50 years ago. They're like different countries. And I think there are a lot of older people in particular, and some, certainly younger people too, who are shocked and dismayed by that. I am not. I welcome it. Let there be more change. Let there be more diversity, more racial diversity, more religious diversity. I think it's great.
Yeah, you're a New Yorker.
I'm a New Yorker. I mean, I love all the people. I love seeing all the people, and I love going to see the Mormons and hear what they do, and talk to my Muslim students and hear what they do. And
have you been to Montreal?
I have been to Montreal.
It's similar in that love of diversity.
Yeah, they're similar, this whole region. I teach philosophy of religion, and I have generally students probably from at least 7 or 8 different religious and irreligious backgrounds in that class. Yeah,
I like the diversity too. Do you have any favorites in the history of Western philosophy that you can just sort of talk about? Can you give me a little overview of that journey of friendship with these kindred spirits over thousands of years of the history of Western philosophy?
One of the first moments philosophically for me that I found somebody that I really had that kind of hero worship of would have been Nietzsche, who I started reading in college. And so Nietzsche was a big eye-opener for me, right? And Nietzsche sort of took me back to the ancient Greeks. And so, I also, around that time, started really reading Plotinus. And so the Neoplatonic philosophers have been really influential on me. Plotinus and Iamblichus, to name sort of 2. So those are my biggest sorts of influences. I mean, and then, of course, you've got intermediate folks like Leibniz. If I had to, pick the kinds of thinkers that I'm really influenced by, it is, Plotinus, Leibniz, and Nietzsche.
Were you impressed by St. Augustine?
I did not like St. Augustine. No, he reminded me too much of the kind of fundamentalism that I was coming out of. Whereas Aquinas, I really liked Aquinas. I liked Aquinas here's a guy and he's looking at all the options, and of course there are different times. Augustine really is kind of trying to defend a nascent Christianity, so he's a little more aggressive. And I really liked Anselm. I really like Anselm too. I think Anselm has a really sharp mind.
Yeah.
Whereas I have to say it, I think Anselm's a better philosopher than Augustine. I mean, Augustine's a philosopher because he read Plotinus, right?
And Cicero.
Yeah, and Cicero too, I think. Yeah.
Cicero was influenced by the Stoics. Is that true or no?
Yes, Cicero was greatly influenced by the Stoics. I mean, he's more of a writer, I would say, than a philosopher. He's summarizing a lot of views. His little book on the nature of the gods is a really good summary of pagan theology in Rome at his time. Right, book 1 is about the Epicureans, book 2 is the Stoics, and then book 3 is ancient atheism, the arguments against the gods. And I mean, if you have to you look at this stuff historically, I mean, Anselm's argument is the only non-pagan argument in Christianity. I mean, the Platonists had the cosmological and design arguments. The Stoics had the design arguments, the degrees of perfection arguments, and all those arguments were, and also the Epicureans had the argument from evil. But you'll see almost all those arguments in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods.
Is it a fun book to read?
It is a fun book to read. It's a dialogue, and I don't know if you've read Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion. He basically takes the Ciceronian structure, and he himself read On the Nature of the Gods. It's a fun book to read. Yeah, you should read it.
Cool.
Not long either.
If you had to say that you had a special interest within the philosophy of religion, what would that be, generally speaking? A focus or an expertise?
Yeah, my special interest in the philosophy of religion is new and emerging religions.
Contemporary?
Contemporary, yeah.
Wow. How many of you are there worldwide that are doing that?
As far as I know, me. In philosophy of religion right now, particularly, I would guess, analytic philosophy of religion, the field is in a lot of turmoil, with a lot of people saying that it has to become more diverse. And so I'm trying to help it along in that way. So in sociology or anthropology, there's a lot more diversity in the study of religion. So I hope analytic philosophy of religion will get more diverse. But I know people there are philosophers who work in Buddhism and they write for Buddhist journals and they just do Buddhist things, for instance. But in sort of traditional philosophy of religion, there's not much diversity at this point. I think it's starting. I talk to younger thinkers who are open to doing more diverse things. So, yeah.
Are you looking for unity in diversity, or are you looking for diversity's sake?
I think I'm looking for diversity. I don't know if it's for diversity's sake.
But is unity a goal for you?
Nah. Everything came from the one.
Okay.
Man.
Okay.
Came from the one.
Okay. Yeah, you want the rainbow.
Yeah, I don't quite want the rainbow, though. I mean, because I don't think that look, one of the things that you see with let's just pick contemporary paganism, and I study that a lot. You see an explosion of pent-up energy, right? All these new forms of art and music and ritual and
sex,
belief and practice. It's chaos. What'd you say?
I said sex. You missed the key ingredient, sex.
Yeah, I don't know if there's that much. That's always to be like, oh yeah, we're gonna dance naked in the woods and that. That's like
in the moonlight.
No, I've gone to pagan circles and they're fun. You dance around, but nah. I do think it's wild, like you say, and that's just because everybody's running out of the gates, and I think that's gonna calm down, and a lot of stuff that doesn't make much sense is going to get weeded out.
What would you say? Have you ever had the experience where a young person or a middle-aged person came to you and said, I've got a philosophical problem, a religious problem, and I need to talk to someone. Please help me, please listen to me, and please give me some advice. Has that happened? If it has happened, give me an example, please. And if it has not happened, what would you say, hypothetically, to support someone's journey with this sort of existential angst or religious problem or philosophical problem? What could you say?
I think that sort of thing, somebody coming to me and saying they had a religious or philosophical problem or issue they wanted to talk about, it certainly has happened to me, especially since I'm a philosophy professor, but mostly in the past. Because now, at least in the context that I'm in, I think that people are so eclectic and so, at least around New York City, New Jersey, people have learned to kind of work out the different ways of solving these problems for themselves. 20-some years ago, when I first started teaching where I am now, William Patterson University in New Jersey, the students were uniformly Catholics. Italian or Irish Catholic background, North Jersey. But their parents had probably stopped going to church, and maybe they went to Catholic school, but it's like maybe they didn't want to be Catholic anymore, but they didn't know what they wanted to be, and they had a lot of existential angst, like you say. I would say in the 20-plus years I've been there, that situation's changed dramatically. whatever background they came from, they grew up with Muslim friends, they grew up with atheist friends, they grew up with Wiccans. They seem completely at ease in traveling this religious space.
What is the role of tension? Because hearkening back to Aristotle said something about the tension in a musical instrument. The beauty of the violin or the guitar is that tension in the chord, and it gives it life and it gives it musicality. That idea of tension and beauty, it seems to be missing from a sort of anything goes, everything's accepted, everything's diverse, everyone's seen everything, and the tension seems to be dissolving, and I'm wondering if there's going to be a beautiful music emerging from these slack chords.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a reasonable kind of concern. So perhaps what you're getting at is there doesn't really seem to be much depth of commitment. On the other hand, that just might, I mean, like it or not, that might be the future, right? I mean, it might be that people assemble a kind of religious identity from lots of different places, lots of different pieces. There's a writer that I really love a lot, Gloria Anzaldúa, and she's a Hispanic-American, Mexican-American, was born almost literally on the Texas-Mexican border. And she talks about this kind of place that she calls Nepantla, which is a place where everything's just mixed up. Everything is everything else. And she says that's where we're at. And we live in multiplicity. I don't know. I mean, you brought up Aristotle there, and it's interesting because if you think about, like, let's say ancient Roman or Greek pagans, right? They had no problem with, here are a whole bunch of other gods, or and the Roman Empire certainly made contact with Hinduism and Buddhism, and there were Egyptian gods and the Greek gods, and it's not even clear like how many Zeuses there are. There are different legends and stories, they conflict, and people didn't seem. I confess that I am puzzled by how they thought of their gods and goddesses. Right? It's certainly not like we think of them, even in neo-pagan terms.
What is at the heart of the religious instinct? Why do we have religion? What is religion? What's the definition of religion? Essentially and fundamentally, what is it for you, religion?
Yeah, it is astonishing. It's one of the astonishing things about even philosophy of religion. There's no definition of religion. There's no accepted definition of religion. You would think that philosophy of religion, given that it's philosophy, would want to start with a definition of what it's studying. No one has a clue. And some people are nihilists about that. They're maybe I should say deflationists. They say, look, religion was a category made up by Christian missionaries in the 17th, 18th centuries. There was, if you ask the Greeks, what is your religion, they would have been puzzled, And people make a good case for this, that, if you go to Japan or China or even India and say religion, well, they don't have words for that, and then the Japanese word for religion is introduced after Christian missionaries keep pestering them about what is their religion. And so some people really insist that it's not just a Western concept, but it's a modern Western concept, because nobody can figure out what it is. And I think we are these creatures who are kind of lost in a forest here, right, where people do all kinds of things. Is Buddhism a religion? Is Stoicism a religion? There are all these new Stoics running around, right? I'm happy with little concepts. Like, I think, I annoy my Stoic friends by saying Stoicism is a kind of neo-paganism, and they're like, no, it's not. We don't worship the goddess. I'm like, yeah, well, most pagans don't either. So, but you guys are reviving an ancient pagan tradition. You're doing old pagan stuff, and so there you are.
Who comes to mind as an example of a religious person? Who would you go out on a limb and say is a religious person?
I mean, look, that's easy to say within, an Abrahamic context, right? I mean, you're going to say, oh, well,
Abraham.
Moses. Yeah, Abraham, Moses, all those guys, Jesus, Muhammad, right?
Back in the good old days.
Yeah, this is back in the good old days, but through those traditions, Joseph Smith, my grandfather, these are all religious people. Was Nietzsche a religious person? I think he was a deeply religious person. He said, oh, he was an atheist, he's a whatever. I'm like, yeah, so what? I mean, he's also the son of a preacher, got deeply religious concerns, has all these wild experiences, and in many ways he's trying to revive old ancient Greek kinds of pagan ideals.
Stoicism was huge for him.
Oh, absolutely. Before he started writing philosophy, right, he was a classics scholar, right? He was a philologist. He studied, ancient languages. So,
who are your enemies, would you say, in the domain of ideas, in the realm of philosophy and this sort of thing, and religion?
Yeah. There are people who are frustrating to me. They're frustrating, but they're not enemies. I get frustrated by both sides of the current religious debates, right? I get frustrated by the atheists who say, like, science is everything and we know it all. And I'm like, I believe in science. Yeah, sure. But I also know that science is a mess. I know what the nightmare scenario in physics is. And yeah, if you're going to tell me that you can use crystals to channel, quantum dolphin teleportation, then forget it. That's lunatic, right? I don't want to hear about the woo-woo, new agey stuff. But I don't want, I wouldn't say they're enemies either. I'm like, okay, this is what you guys are doing is weird and it's interesting. And so there are fewer and fewer, but they're still there. Some of the evangelical philosophers of religion, they can be a little tough to deal with. But I think I don't want to be all things to all people, but I do want to try to look at what they're doing that in terms of religion or spirituality, that there's a deepening, right? I mean, I deal with atheists who tell me, like, I shouldn't use the word spiritual. Don't use the word spiritual. And I'm like, you know what, man, you're just as, that is just as bad as the fundamentalism I grew up with. Certainly there are racist pagan groups. I don't want to have anything to do with them. I don't tolerate that in the least. And there are, certainly white supremacists among Christian groups in the United States. I don't tolerate that in the least. And religion can be bad. It's not always good. I'm interested in the ways that we can try to use it, whatever it is, to good ends. It's also not like I don't have my own sorts of preferences religiously. But I am fascinated if somebody's trying something new and interesting, and, I want to take a step back philosophically. So one of the things that bothers me is, let's call it New Age religion or spirituality. It bothers me because I don't understand it, all right? And I have an instinctive reflex to say something very negative that's just bullshit. It's insane, it's crazy, it's all these negative words. But I keep being taken back to the simple fact that it's so widely practiced around the world. Pew Research Foundation just came out with a survey where they were saying, like, look, even in the heart of Christendom and USA, New Age beliefs of one kind or another are widespread. When they actually drill deeper into the data and they say, well, I'm a Christian. Well, do you believe in reincarnation? Of course I do. Or do you believe there's a spiritual energy in all things? Absolutely. God is energy. Like, can you charge crystals with psychic power? Absolutely. Of course you can. And so I'm baffled. So that it distresses me that I feel like I'm looking at something emerging that I don't understand what it is. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I was deep in the New Age before my conversion. It's a form of Gnosticism where the spirit is good, the body is bad. Of course, not every adherent of New Age knows that there's a Gnostic background to it, but the basic idea is that you are God, you are creative, you are the creative supreme being, you can create your own reality. It's called the New Thought movement, where the spirit that's in us is the ultimate reality. And although you don't see New Age people acknowledging the fact that theoretically the body is evil, there is at the root of the New Age this idea that the spirit is the supreme reality, and I guess it's a form of idealism.
It's interesting that you mentioned New Thought, right? And I've read Caddy's book, Emily Caddy. Of course, I can't remember the title. So I'm a little god with a failing memory and arthritis. So maybe these guys have a point. So You might have portrayed one. It would be nice to be able to pin New Age down.
It's eclectic, just like Gnosticism, very eclectic.
Yeah, it's a monster with 1,000 heads.
Yeah, its name is Legion.
Its name is Legion. Yeah, sure. It seems to be growing with such. This is the kind of thing I wish philosophers would think about, you know? But I wish that philosophers would, like, look at what's happening around them. Philosophers of religion. In other disciplines of philosophy, they do. You know, philosophy of science, you look at what's going on in science.
Yeah, I don't know how you have the courage to deal with contemporary issues, you know, in any sort of social dynamic. It's really, really tough. Does that overwhelm you at all?
No, it doesn't overwhelm me. I mean, it's just look. I find it fascinating. I go to a cousin's house, and they're good Christians, but they've got the Tao of everyday living on the. I can't find the Bible, but the Tao of everyday living is there. I don't know the exact title. Some of these Taoist New Age Taoism books, and they've got little feathers hanging here and there and crystals. I'm like, what's going on? That's just. Something's going on here, and I don't understand what it is. I'm just happy. I mean, it could be overwhelming. It could be like, oh, there's this, its name is Legion. There's this thing growing. Maybe it's not good. But I just I try to look at the individual people and see how do they think of what they're doing, right?
Can you try to convey to me what your perspective is talking to me right now? Are there theses that are being tested in your mind as you talk to me? Are you gathering data, or is this just a conversation between two people, or what is it? What is it like for you?
It's a conversation between two people. This is what I like. I got to hear you. I got to listen to what you're saying. I got to try to make sense of it. And of course, lots of things go on in my mind. I think, well, Catholicism is extremely diverse theologically. Peter Forrest is a really... he's a committed. He'll tell you he's as much of a committed Catholic as you are, and boy, his theological views. He's a philosopher, but he's got a way out theology. He thinks there is this primordial will, and it evolved into this plurality of divine beings that became loving, and then I talk to him. I'm like, yeah, Peter, I believe in all this crazy stuff, man. Look at my. I'm unique, and I got this. I got this brilliant perspective never before anybody. And he'll be like, he says, Eric, you're just a Catholic with a weird theory of angels. And he'll like lay it out and explain it to me how that's true. And then I'm like, oh, wow, never thought of it that way. So I like to talk with you, with him, with my Mormon friends, my Wiccan friends. Fascinating my father was also a biologist, right? And maybe that's it. Maybe it's like, look at this ecosystem of people, so that's where I'm at.
At the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to give the closing thought, and it's just a positive message from your own perspective, from your own experience. So just to end the show, what might you say to anyone that's out there listening now?
I'd like to say to everybody that I think right now is a very religiously interesting time to be alive, one of the most interesting times in the last several thousand years. And I would like people to explore their religious and spiritual sides, to think about how they can seek the good through their religiosity or spirituality. It's not as simple as any kind of us versus them, whoever the us is and the they are. It's not that simple. I don't have a simplifying message. Life is complex. Life is messy. We got to work it out for ourselves. So I would encourage everybody to have hope and to have a faith in the future, a faith that good will prevail. It does prevail. And that's where I would leave it.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you've got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.